Alien reacts. Human soldier rescues 14 cadets alone. The distress signal had been active for 11 minutes when I first saw it flag on the tactical board. 11 minutes. In CAD doctrine, a distress signal that old without a confirmed response unit already in motion was not a rescue situation. It was a recovery operation. You noted it, you logged it, and you filed a request for orbital extraction when the window opened. That was the protocol. That was the logical thing to do. I was not a field officer. I was Velthera, senior analyst, 3rd Intelligence Division of the Cathay Alliance Fleet. My job was to sit in rooms like this one, breathe recycled air, and review recordings after events had already concluded. I was good at my job. I liked my job. Nothing about my job had ever made me feel the way I felt during the 47 hours it took me to review the full footage package from Veron 7. The data packet arrived in my queue on a standard morning cycle. My supervisor, Commander Drell Kai, had flagged it with a single annotation. Review and prepare assessment for council briefing. Priority classification. You will find this unusual. That was all. Drell Kai was not someone who used the word unusual. She had reviewed combat engagements from 6 different species across 4 decades of service. I opened the packet. The outpost designated Veron 7 was a training station. That matters. It was not a military installation in the fighting sense. It had no heavy weapon emplacements, no defensive grid worth the name, no garrison force beyond 2 senior instructors and a logistics officer. It existed for one purpose only: to give young Cathay cadets between the ages of roughly 12 and 16 in human equivalent years their first exposure to field conditions. They learned to read topographic maps. They practiced communication protocols. They ran drills in terrain navigation and emergency shelter construction. They were children learning to become soldiers, which meant they were neither yet. On the morning the signal activated, there were 14 cadets on station. Their 2 instructors had gone to a supply relay point 4 kilometers north to collect equipment packages. The logistics officer, a male named Reth Po, had remained behind. The attack came before he could seal the inner doors. I will not describe what the Vrakian raiders did to Reth Po in the courtyard. I will say only that the thermal sensors recorded it, and that I reviewed the footage with my professional face on, and that afterward I sat very still for a while before continuing. The Vrakians were not known for mercy. They were known for territory expansion by force, for using fear as a tactical instrument, and for a cultural contempt toward what they called soft-world species. The Cathay, being a civilization that had built its strength on collective intelligence and cooperative strategy, rather than individual physical capacity, were very much considered a soft-world species. The 14 cadets hiding in the supply room at the eastern end of the station knew this. Their biosign data, which the station's internal monitors were still transmitting despite the breach, showed heart rates and neurological stress markers that I found very difficult to look at. They were terrified. They were children, and they were terrified, and they were alone. And by every calculation available to Alliance Command when the signal was received, they were going to stay alone for at least 72 hours until the orbital extraction window aligned. The 2 instructors, upon receiving emergency communication of the breach, had begun moving back toward the station but were still kilometers away. A response unit from the nearest Alliance post was 3 hours out at best speed. Command had logged the distress signal, noted the situation, and marked the file, hold for extraction window. That was the sensible thing to do. I want to be clear about that. Sending a small response unit into an active Vrakian raider occupation would likely result only in additional casualties. Waiting for orbital extraction was the mathematically correct decision. I understand this. I agreed with it, reading the file, before I reached the part that changed everything. The part that changed everything was a name. A single human name in a file full of CAD designations. Sergeant Marcus Hale, Coalition Auxiliary Forces Human Division. He was not part of Veron 7. He was not part of any response plan. He was listed in the station's proximity logs simply because he had been running a solo reconnaissance mission in the surrounding terrain as part of a separate operation, and the station's external sensors had passively tracked his movement signature, out of automated habit. He was 3 kilometers away when the signal activated. He was alone. He had with him the standard loadout for a solo reconnaissance mission: 1 service rifle, 1 sidearm, a recon pack containing signal equipment, 3 standard fragmentation devices intended for use only in demolition of equipment if capture was imminent, emergency rations, and a field medical kit. That was it. There was no record of him receiving any order to respond. There was no communication log showing him contacting command for authorization. There was only the external sensor data, which showed his move signature pause for approximately 40 seconds after the distress signal broadcast, and then turn directly toward the station and accelerate. I stared at that data point for a long time. I ran the proximity calculation twice because the first result seemed wrong. 3 kilometers of uneven terrain, dense brush, and exposed ridgeline, terrain that the Vrakian raiders had scouts positioned on, terrain that any rational actor would treat as impassable without support. I checked his biosigns from the sensor handoff as he passed into range of the station's outer monitors. His heart rate was elevated. Of course it was elevated. But it was not the pattern of elevation my training told me to expect. There was no hesitation signature, no prolonged spike that would indicate a creature standing still and running probability assessments, weighing options, calculating odds. The elevation was steady and purposeful, the biological signature of a body that had already made its decision and was now simply executing it. He moved at a pace my analysis software flagged as aggressive, not reckless. There is a difference, I would learn, between aggressive and reckless in human movement data. Reckless shows in erratic directional changes, in unnecessary exposure, in the biometric chaos of a creature acting without a plan. Aggressive shows in commitment. Every step Sergeant Marcus Hale took toward that station was committed. He had a route in his head. He was following it. I paused my review here for the first time and pulled his service file. I wanted to know who this person was before I watched what he did. The file was long. It was much longer than I expected for someone of his age. He was 29 years old in human years, which I am told is considered young for a career soldier of his rank. This service record contained 11 separate entries under the heading Notable, Actions before the events at Veron 7-11. I did not read them all at that moment. I bookmarked the file and returned to the footage. He reached the outer perimeter of Run 7 in under 20 minutes. The Vrakian position at that point had 17 combatants actively moving through the station's outer zones and 14 more in a consolidated hold position near the main entrance, with 2 armored terrain crawlers blocking the primary access road and a suppression cannon mounted on the eastern wall. 31 combatants, 2 armored vehicles, and a crew-operated heavy weapon, against 1 human with a rifle, 3 demolition charges that were not intended as offensive weapons, and whatever he could find. I noted the timestamp on the footage. I noted the timestamp on the distress signal. And then I noted something else, something small and easy to miss, something that I found myself thinking about long after the analysis was complete. 11 minutes had passed between the distress signal and the moment Marcus Hale reached the station perimeter, which meant he had started moving almost immediately. Which meant that 40-second pause in his movement data, that brief moment before he turned toward the station, was not him deciding whether to go. I realized, thinking about it in the silence of my analysis room, that I did not actually know what that pause was. I pulled the audio from his personal recorder, which had been running on standard automatic the entire time. The recording caught 38 seconds of ambient terrain noise, the distant sound of the alert signal transmitting, and then his voice, low and very quiet, saying 4 words to no one in particular. My translation software rendered them as, "All right then, coming." That was all, and then he moved. I am an analyst. I have spent my career building frameworks for understanding why beings in extreme situations make the choices they make. I have models for fear response, for heroism as social performance, for the neurological drivers of risk-taking behavior. I have a lot of frameworks. I did not have a framework for those 4 words. I saved the audio file, I flagged it. I sat with it for a moment longer than was professionally necessary. And then I pressed play on the next segment of footage, because 14 cadets had been trapped in a supply room with Vrakian raiders 40 meters from their door, and the man I was watching had decided that was not going to stay true. I was beginning to understand that with Marcus Hale, once he decided something was not going to stay true, the universe tended to cooperate. The first thing he did when he reached the perimeter was nothing. I want to be precise about this because the nothing is important. He found a low position behind a broken section of the outer barrier wall, went completely still, and for 4 minutes and 17 seconds he did not move. His biosigns during this window showed the focused, even pattern that my training database associated with high-level concentration. He was not resting, he was not afraid. He was reading the situation the way I read data, methodically and completely, before making a single move. I watched the external sensor feeds from that same 4-minute window and tried to see what he was seeing. Vrakian patrol pattern on the eastern side, 2 scouts, irregular intervals, a gap of roughly 90 seconds between passes. The armored crawlers were positioned with their heavier plating facing the main road, which was the expected threat direction. The suppression cannon crew had settled into a low-activity posture, which meant they were not expecting trouble from any direction other than the one command had told them to watch. The main group of 14 raiders near the entrance was clustered, talking, not in combat formation. They thought this was already finished. They thought the most dangerous thing left to do was wait. That was their mistake. Not the only one they would make, but the first and most important. They had stopped imagining that something could threaten them. Marcus Hale was still imagining that, I would come to understand, was the defining characteristic of how he operated. He never stopped imagining what was possible. He moved during a patrol gap. He covered ground fast, lower than seemed comfortable, using the scrub vegetation along the inner barrier base, in a way that suggested he had studied exactly how much cover it offered before committing to the path. He reached the eastern crawler in under 2 minutes. The sensor data showed him moving around to the crawler's undercarriage, and I switched to the closest available camera angle to follow what he was doing. He was under the vehicle for 86 seconds. I timed it. When he came back out, 2 of his 3 demolition charges were gone. I pulled the technical specifications for that crawler model from the Alliance database. It was a Vrakian Mk4 heavy terrain vehicle, used primarily for perimeter enforcement and troop transport, substantial armor. Powered by a compression fuel system with the primary coupling located beneath the chassis on the vehicle's left rear quadrant. The charges he had placed were not designed to destroy a vehicle. They were designed for equipment demolition, control panels, communication arrays, light machinery. They should not have been sufficient. I cross-referenced the exact placement with the vehicle schematics. He had not put the charges on the armor. He had put them on the fuel coupling itself, and on the connecting line that ran from the coupling to the secondary reserve. When those charges went off, they would not try to punch through the armor. They would rupture the fuel system from the inside, and the pressure release would do the rest. I checked his service record again for any listed expertise in Vrakian vehicle systems. There was nothing official. There was a notation from a commanding officer 18 months earlier that read, Hale has an unusual habit of reading technical manuals for enemy equipment in his personal time. Consider for cross-training. It had not been followed up on. He had done this on his own. He had read the manuals because he wanted to. Now that knowledge was sitting under a Vrakian crawler as a very patient problem. He moved to the north side of the station before the charges activated. He needed distance, and he needed a second position established before the situation changed. I watched him reach a drainage channel that ran along the inner compound wall and drop into it, getting low, waiting. The patrol passed 12 meters above him and did not look down. Then the eastern crawler went up. It was not a large explosion by the standard of warfare. It was precise. The fuel system ruptured exactly as the technical specifications suggested it would, when compromised at the coupling point, and the resulting pressure release took the vehicle's undercarriage out and dropped the whole mass onto its side. The crew was thrown clear. The vehicle was finished. And the Vrakian force, which had been comfortable and settled and not expecting anything, came apart instantly into loud, reactive chaos. This was exactly what Marcus Hale needed. Chaos, I was learning, was something he worked with rather than against. The 14 raiders from the main entrance group split into a response pattern, moving toward the sound and the light. The suppression cannon crew swung their weapon around, which pointed it away from the interior. The remaining scouts broke from their patrol lines and converged on the eastern side. For approximately 40 seconds, the entire Vrakian attention was pointed in one direction. He was already moving in the other. The station's service entrance was on the western wall. It was a maintenance access point, narrow and low, secured with a standard Cathay mechanical lock that was not built to resist a determined person with a field toolkit and a reason to hurry. He had it open in under a minute. I watched him slip inside and the door close behind him, and for a moment the internal sensors lost him in a dead zone corridor where the camera coverage had a gap. 11 seconds. Then he reappeared on the feed covering the inner service passage, moving fast heading east toward the supply rooms. His leg was bleeding. I had not noticed it before because the external camera angles had been too distant, but the internal sensors were closer, and the resolution was better, and I could see the dark stain on his lower left leg that had not been there when he entered the station. He had picked up an injury during the approach, probably from the barrier wall or the drainage channel. He had not stopped. He had not treated it. He was moving at the same pace as before, maybe faster. I checked his biometrics. Pain response indicators were active. He knew it was there. He had assessed it, determined it was not going to stop him, and moved on. The clinical detachment of that assessment was something I found both impressive and slightly unsettling. Pain, for most species I had studied, was a compelling argument. For Marcus Hale it appeared to be a data point. The supply room was at the end of the Eastern Service corridor, 80 meters from where he had entered. He covered it in less than a minute. The door was a heavy internal security door, sealed from the inside, which meant the cadets had done the right thing and locked themselves in. He knocked 3 times, then twice, then once. A pattern. I found out later that this was something humans did in old stories, a way of signaling identity through a closed door. He must have hoped, or perhaps calculated, that whoever was inside would know enough to recognize a non-threatening pattern. There was a pause of about 20 seconds. Then the door opened. The first thing I saw when the interior camera picked up the room was 14 young Kethi faces, and the fear in those faces was something I recognized immediately because Kethi fear looks the same regardless of age. Wide receptor membranes, flattened crest plates, bodies pulled inward and close together in the instinctive collective mass response our species uses when threatened. They had been in that room, listening to everything happening outside, and they had no way of knowing what was coming through that door. What came through the door was a human. Marcus Hale was not a physically unusual human being as far as I could determine from the footage. He was of average height for his species, lean rather than heavy, with dark hair and a face that my translation software could not assign a definitive emotional tag to because the expression was layered. There was focus in it, there was urgency, and there was something else that I kept returning to in my analysis and kept failing to name precisely. He looked at those 14 terrified young faces and he did not look afraid. He did not look like a person calculating odds. He looked like someone who had arrived where he intended and was now going to do what he had come to do, and the details of the situation were already being sorted in his mind into categories of manageable and irrelevant. He said something. The room's audio pickup was not strong, but my software cleaned it up reasonably well. He said, "Hey, my name is Marcus. Nobody is going anywhere they do not want to go today. But I need you to listen to me for a little while, all right?" And then, before any of them could respond, he did something that stopped my analysis completely and made me rewind the footage twice to confirm I had seen it correctly. He crouched down. One of the cadets was very small, the youngest in the group. I cross-referenced with the station's enrollment records. His name was Venlo. He was 12 years old. He was pressed into the corner furthest from the door, and he had his arms wrapped around himself, and his crest plates were so flat they were almost invisible. He was, by any behavioral measure I had available, in a state of severe distress. Marcus Hale walked to that corner, and he crouched down to Venlo's eye level, and he put one hand gently on the young cadet's upper arm, and he waited. He did not say anything immediately. He just waited, at that level, until Venlo's receptor membranes shifted fractionally, and the young cadet looked at him directly. Then he said something else. The audio caught fragments of it, enough for my software to reconstruct. "It is okay to be scared. It just means you know what matters. You matter. So let us get you home." Venlo's biometrics shifted, the stress markers dropped. Not all the way, not even close to calm, but they dropped. A small, frightened child had been reached, in the middle of a crisis, by a stranger speaking a different language through a translation unit, and had been fractionally steadied. Because a man had taken 47 seconds to kneel down and speak at eye level instead of moving efficiently toward his objective. 47 seconds. I counted them because in those 47 seconds, the situation outside the door was deteriorating. The Vrakian force was reorganizing after the crawler incident. The chaos window he had created was closing. Every second he spent in that room was a second the enemy used to regain composure. He spent 47 of them making sure a 12-year-old child felt less alone. I sat with this for a long time. I have reviewed a great deal of combat footage in my career. I have watched beings do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. I have built models around what separates effective combatants from ineffective ones, around what psychological profiles produce what outcomes in high-pressure scenarios. I had a framework for almost everything. I did not have a framework for a man choosing to be gentle in the middle of a situation that was demanding he be only fast. When he stood back up, he looked at the older cadets. The oldest were around 15 and 16, old enough to follow instruction and young enough to be terrified. He assessed them for perhaps 3 seconds, and then he began to speak, and my translation software caught it clearly because his voice had changed. It was still calm, but it had a shape to it now. "A direction," he said. "I need to know who here is the strongest. I need to know who here has the best eyes in the dark. and I need to know if anyone here knows this building better than everyone else." 3 cadets responded. He listened to each one and assigned them a role immediately, no deliberation, as if he had already built the plan and was now slotting people into the spaces that existed for them. The 2 physically strongest cadets, both 16, were told they would help carry anyone who could not keep pace. A cadet named Senvir, who had apparently spent extra study time on the station's layout, was placed at the front of the group to guide movement through the interior. A cadet who was just barely 15, small and quick, was handed Marcus Hale's sidearm and given an instruction that I thought was remarkable in its simplicity. "You only use this if something comes through a door when I am not the one opening it. If I am the one opening it, you wait until I tell you, do you understand?" The cadet understood. I could see it in the straightened posture, the biometrics evening out from panic into something closer to purpose. He had given them something to do. He had turned 14 frightened individuals into something that at least had the shape of a unit. In 4 minutes and 30 seconds, there was a sound in the corridor outside, heavy footsteps, Vrakian movement patterns, which were distinct because of the weight distribution their body type produced. The cadets froze. Marcus Hale did not freeze. He moved to the door in 4 steps, put his back to the wall beside it, and became very still. The kind of still that is not passive but is instead a coiled and waiting kind of stillness. The footsteps passed. They were not stopping at this door, not yet. He turned back to the group and made a short gesture with his hand forward. Now, he led them out of the supply room and into the corridor, and I was watching on the internal sensors, and what I saw was this. He moved at the front of the group, and he moved in a way that constantly placed his body between the direction of potential threat and the 14 cadets behind him. It was not incidental. Every turn, every pause, every position change was structured around maintaining that coverage. He was navigating and leading, and simultaneously using himself as a physical barrier, and he was doing all 3 things without apparent effort, because they had, I suspected, become too habitual in him to require conscious thought. The drainage of blood from his leg was visible on the internal camera feeds now. It was more than a scrape. Whatever he had caught on the approach, it had opened a meaningful wound in his lower left leg, and the field bandage he had apparently applied at some point was soaking through. His gait showed a slight compensation that my medical analysis module identified as a response to significant discomfort. He was not slowing down. The route Senvir was guiding them along took the group through the station's maintenance network, a series of low-lit service corridors that were narrower than the main passages and not on the Vrakian force's primary search grid. Smart. The Vrakians were looking in the places where people were supposed to be. Marcus Hale was moving through the places where pipes were supposed to be. They covered 60 meters without contact. Then the sensor feed showed a problem. 2 Vrakian scouts had been assigned to check the maintenance network specifically, possibly because a unit leader with tactical sense had realized that the interior spaces had not been fully cleared. They were coming from the north end of the service passage, moving south, which meant they were heading directly toward the group. Marcus Hale saw it before I could finish processing what I was seeing. He stopped the group with a raised fist. He counted the cadets quickly. He pointed Senvir at a branching corridor to the right, held up 4 fingers, then pointed at the branch again. 4 turns. Take the 4th right. Then he pointed at himself, and at the corridor ahead, and he held up 2 fingers, which I interpreted as meaning he would handle the 2 scouts. He disappeared into the darkness of the northern passage before any of the cadets could react. I want to describe what happened next on the sensor feed, but the camera coverage in the northern maintenance corridor was limited, and what I had was more audio than visual. 2 distinct sounds of impact, a brief scuffle shorter than I expected, much shorter, then silence. Then Marcus Hale walking back to the branch point, slightly faster than before, with a new bruise visible on his jaw that had not been there 60 seconds earlier. He said nothing about it. He just looked at the cadets to confirm they had not moved, saw that they had not, and pointed at the 4th right route again. They moved. His biometrics during the corridor engagement with the 2 scouts had shown a sharp spike that dropped back down within 8 seconds. 8 seconds of maximum physical engagement, full commitment, and then it was over, and his body was already settling back toward the operational baseline he maintained throughout. The speed of that recovery was something my health analysis module flagged twice as statistically unusual. For species, humans, according to the physiological data in my database, typically required longer recovery periods after intense physical stress. Marcus Hale appeared to be running on a shorter cycle than typical. Either through training or through something that was simply how he was built, he returned to functional faster. I noted this. I did not yet know how important this would become. The group reached the corridor junction that Senvir had identified as the last navigation point before the extraction route. They were 30 meters from the ventilation shaft exit that opened to the open ground beyond the station's east perimeter, where sufficient distance from the Vrakian-occupied areas would allow for safe signal transmission and contact with the extraction unit now. Confirmed as 2 hours out, 30 meters, one junction, one final passage. The sensors showed 12 Vrakian combatants moving to consolidate in the eastern zone. The unit leader had figured out that the eastern crawler had not failed on its own. Someone had done something to it, which meant someone was inside the perimeter, and that someone was moving the cadets. The search was contracting, tightening, pulling toward this part of the station like a closing hand. Marcus Hale looked at the sensor display panel on the corridor wall, one of the station's public information screens that was still running on backup power, still showing threat position data because no one had thought to turn it off. He studied it for perhaps 6 seconds. Then he turned to the cadets and pointed at the route ahead. He made the walking signal with 2 fingers. Move. Keep moving. Do not stop. The oldest cadet, 16, whose name was Person, looked at him and then at the sensor display and understood what it showed. He looked back at Marcus Hale with what I can only describe as a question in his eyes. Marcus Hale gave him a very small, very calm smile. Then he stepped back, positioning himself at the junction, his rifle up, watching the northern corridor from which the converging Vrakian group would arrive. He was going to hold the junction. 14 cadets were moving toward the exit. He was going to stand at the point between them and everything that was coming, and he was going to make sure nothing followed them. Person held the eye contact for 1 more second. Then he nodded once. The Kethai gesture of understanding turned around and led the group forward. 13 cadets followed. Marcus Hale stood at the junction, alone, with 12 armed opponents inbound, a wound in his leg that should have grounded him an hour ago, and a rifle with a partial magazine. And the sensor data showed his heart rate in that moment was 138 beats per minute. Elevated but steady, focused, committed. The footsteps from the north corridor were getting louder. He could hear them. He turned to face the sound, and the camera on the junction wall caught his face in that moment, and I paused on that frame a long time because the expression I had been unable to name earlier was visible again and clearer now. It was not fear. It was not bravado. It was something quieter and more absolute than either. It was the face of a person who had made a decision that was already finished, who had no argument left inside him about whether this was the right thing because that argument had concluded somewhere back on the hillside when he heard a distress signal and turned toward it. He was simply here, present, ready. The first Vrakian appeared at the far end of the corridor, and Marcus Hale squared to face it, and I pressed play on the next segment of footage, and I stopped breathing for a moment in the way that I imagined the 14 cadets behind him had stopped breathing, too, for different reasons. The corridor was 30 meters long and not quite 2 meters wide. I noted these measurements because they mattered. In a narrow space, the numerical advantage of 12 against 1 becomes less overwhelming than it sounds. There is only so much room. Only so many bodies can occupy a given point at a given time. A narrow corridor does not give a larger force the ability to use all of its size at once. This was not a coincidence. Marcus Hale had positioned himself at that junction deliberately. I ran the geometry in my analysis software before I continued the footage. The northern approach was the only viable entry vector from the direction of the converging force. The side passages off the junction corridor were sealed. Maintenance-only access that the Vrakians would need specific tools to open quickly. Any force coming at him had to come straight down that one corridor, in a column, and engage him in sequence rather than simultaneously. He had turned a 12 versus 1 engagement into something closer to a series of 1 versus 1 engagements with limited overlap. I had studied tactical positioning in my training. I had read hundreds of historical accounts from dozens of species. What Marcus Hale had done with his choice of where to stand was textbook, except that no one had taught this to him in the last 30 seconds. He had seen the corridor and simply known. The first Vrakian came in fast. They were a physically substantial species, broad across the upper body, with reinforced armor at the chest and shoulders that was standard issue for their raider units. The first shot Marcus Hale fired hit the armor and did not penetrate. I watched him process this in real time, the slight adjustment in his posture, the half-second recalculation. He fired again lower. The Vrakian went down. The second came in right behind the first and Marcus Hale was already moving, not backward, laterally, getting to the side of the corridor, so the incoming movement could not simply run over him. The Vrakian had a short-range impact weapon and swung it hard. He went under it. I watched this on the sensor feed and my analysis software, running automatic assessments in the background, flagged the dodge as a reaction time of 0.31 seconds. The Kethi standard for trained combat personnel was 0.44 seconds. The human average in my database was listed at 0.38 seconds. He was faster than the average data suggested he should be. I noted this without yet having a framework for what it meant. The second Vrakian went down. The third and fourth arrived together, which was when the situation became genuinely complicated. I watched 2 minutes of the sensor feed from that junction, with increasing difficulty maintaining the clinical distance that my job required. He was struck twice, once across the upper shoulder, and once, more significantly, in the left leg that was already injured. The biometric data spiked sharply on that second hit. The pain response indicators went to levels that my medical module flagged with a warning. Notation: he did not stop, he did not fall back. His movement became tighter, more conservative with the damaged leg, compensating the way a structure compensates for a compromised load-bearing point by distributing weight differently. He was fighting like a building that had cracked but had not yet decided to fall. 4 Vrakians were down, 8 remained, and they had stopped coming one at a time. They were pulling back slightly, which on their part was a tactical adjustment, giving themselves room to coordinate, to bring their weapon range to bear at a distance where his ability to stay close and disrupt their engagement capability was reduced. They were not panicking, they were thinking, they were adapting. So was he. He did not pursue them when they pulled back. He moved instead to the side of the corridor, where an overhead pipe junction created a partial overhang, and he used it. He fired twice down the corridor, not to hit, but to keep heads down, to hold attention at his level while he did something with his hands that the sensor angle did not give me a clear view of. Then he threw something. It bounced off the corridor wall, changed angle, and detonated approximately 4 meters into the Vrakian group. His last demolition charge. The third and final one that had been in his recon pack. He had saved it, and he had used it not to destroy a vehicle but to detonate inside a corridor packed with combatants who had pulled into a tight grouping. 3 more went down in the blast, 2 from the force of it, 1 from the secondary impact of debris. I pulled the damage assessment from my software. 5 remaining combatants, 2 of them showing biometric signatures on the station's passive sensors indicating significant physical compromise. He had gone from 12 to 5, alone in a junction corridor, with a wounded leg and a service rifle, in under 7 minutes. I checked the cadet group. The sensor feed showed them at the ventilation exit. Senvir was working the release mechanism on the shaft cover. Person was at the back of the group, watching the corridor they had come from. Venlo, the youngest, was near the center of the group, and his biometrics showed elevated fear but no longer the acute distress collapse of someone paralyzed. He was moving. He was following. Whatever Marcus Hale had said to him in that corner of the supply room, it was still doing its work. 40 seconds. That was how long the vent exit typically took to open. 40 seconds and they would be out and moving for open ground. 40 seconds was not a comfortable margin. The 5 remaining Vrakians in the corridor were reorganizing. 2 of the compromised ones were pulling back further, removing themselves from the forward position, which meant 3 functional combatants were now moving toward the junction with purpose. The unit leader was among them. He was the one who had ordered the maintenance network sweep, and he was the one who had kept the force from dissolving into disorder after the crawler was lost. And he was looking at this situation with the eyes of someone who understood that something had gone badly wrong with a mission that was supposed to be simple. Marcus Hale was standing at the junction on a leg that my medical analysis module was now classifying as structurally compromised. He had fired a significant portion of his magazine. He had used all 3 demolition charges. His options for the next 40 seconds were, by any standard calculation I could apply, not favorable. The 3 Vrakians came down the corridor. What happened in the next 6 minutes and 22 seconds is something I reviewed 13 times, not because I did not understand what I was seeing, because I kept seeing something new in it each time. Marcus Hale did not fight those 3 opponents the way a trained combatant is supposed to fight. He did not maintain distance and use superior weapon accuracy. He did not attempt to neutralize threats in order of priority. He did not, in any recognizable sense, follow a doctrine. He used the corridor. He used the pipes above him. At one point he used the wall itself, pushing off it to change his angle in a way that the sensor feed showed clearly, but that my biomechanical analysis module rated as inconsistent with standard training patterns for his species. He was not executing a learned system. He was solving a problem in real time, with whatever was available, in whatever form the solution presented itself. The unit leader was the last of the three and the most difficult. He was experienced, and experience in a Vrakian raider meant he had survived a great many engagements, which meant he had made a great many adaptations, and fighting him was not the same as fighting the others. He was reading Marcus Hale, while Marcus Hale was reading him, and for a period of time that my analysis software clocked at 2 minutes and 4 seconds, they moved around each other in that corridor, in something that was almost more like a conversation than a fight. The Vrakian unit leader was the larger, the heavier, and by this point the less injured of the two. He landed a strike to Marcus Hale's right side that the biometric data suggested cracked at least one rib. He was fast and he was strong and he was smart and he was winning on points. Marcus Hale waited. I watched him wait, and I understood after several reviewings that this was intentional. He was absorbing. He was costing the unit leader energy. He was waiting for a specific thing, and when it came, a slightly overextended swing from the unit leader's right arm. A fraction of a second of structural imbalance. He moved so fast that my sensor feed required a slow-motion re-render to follow it. The unit leader went down and did not get back up. Marcus Hale stood at the junction. He was breathing hard enough that the audio pickup caught it clearly. He was holding his right side with his left hand. His leg was a problem that was getting worse. He was not moving efficiently anymore. He was moving because stopping was not an option he was considering. The last two Vrakians, both compromised, were at the far end of the corridor. They saw what had happened to their unit leader. They looked at Marcus Hale, alone in the junction, injured, out of demolition charges, working on a reduced magazine, standing over 7 of their companions. They left. I watched their biosign traces move away fast toward the exit and out of the station's sensor range, and they did not come back. Marcus Hale stood at the junction for 12 seconds after they left. He looked down the empty corridor. Then he looked at the wall beside him. He put one hand against it in a gesture my translation database could not categorize, not leaning, not pushing, just touching, like confirming the wall was real, like confirming that he was still in the physical world. Then he turned around and started moving toward the ventilation exit. His pace was not the same as it had been. The leg was taking its toll in a way that could no longer be compensated by will and training alone. The biometrics were running hot in several indicators simultaneously. He was running on reserve in a way that was not sustainable. But the exit was 30 meters away, and 30 meters was 30 meters, and Marcus Hale put his foot forward one more time, and one more time after that. The sensor feed showed the ventilation exit as open when he arrived. The cadets were already through. He reached the opening and stopped, one hand on the frame, and looked through it at the night air and the dark ground beyond. And then the sensor outside the exit showed something that I had to slow down and review. The cadets were there. All 14 of them, waiting. They had not run for open ground. Person was standing at the head of the group, watching the exit, and when Marcus Hale appeared in the frame, Person did not cheer or speak or make any sound. He simply stepped forward and ducked under Marcus Hale's arm and became a support structure for him. The other 15-year-old took his other side. Venlo, the youngest, the one from the corner, walked directly to the front of the little group they formed and looked back once, and his crest plates were still flat, but his receptor membranes were steady, and he began walking toward open ground, and everyone followed him. Nobody had told them to go back for him. Nobody had ordered them to wait. They were children. They had been through an ordeal that would leave marks on them for years, and they had come out into the open air, and they had looked at each other, and they had waited. Because he had come back for them, I stopped the footage here. I had been reviewing for many hours at this point, and my analysis software had generated 14 separate sub-reports that I was supposed to be integrating into the council briefing document. And I was not doing any of that. I was sitting in my analysis room in the quiet of a late-duty cycle, and I was thinking about 14 cadets who could have run for cover and chose, instead, to be there when a door opened. I checked the hospital records that had been appended to the file. Marcus Hale had been treated for a left leg wound classified as severe, 2 fractured ribs, significant bruising across the upper body, and a secondary infection that had already established itself in the leg wound by the time he reached the medical unit. The treating physician had noted in the file that the leg wound had been significantly worsened by prolonged activity after initial injury, and that without that prolonged activity, the prognosis would have been considerably less complicated. Without that prolonged activity, I read this notation several times. What it meant in plain language was, he had made his injury much worse by continuing to move. By choosing to keep going after the leg was already serious. And the reason he had done that, the reason he had made his own physical situation considerably more difficult, was that 14 cadets had been on the wrong side of a locked door, and he had decided they were going to be on the right side of it. I added a note to my own private file: prolonged activity, the clinical language for a man who refused to stop. I looked at the photograph attached to his service record. He was not looking at the camera with any particular expression. He looked like a person standing in front of a camera, comfortable in his own presence, not performing anything. He had dark eyes and a face that had seen weather and time, and things that I could now estimate fairly accurately. He looked, to my perception, like someone who had made a very large number of small decisions about who he was going to be, one at a time, over a long period of time, until those decisions had become indistinguishable from the person himself. I have a word in my language for that kind of person. It translates poorly into human standard. The closest rendering is something like, one who has become what they decided to be. It is a compliment of a very particular kind in Cathay culture. We give it rarely. We give it to beings who have done the difficult work of collapsing the distance between intention and action until there is no gap left between them. I added it to his file, in my own notation system, in my own language. Then I began writing the analysis report that the council had asked for. I finished the first draft of the tactical analysis report at 4 hours into the following duty cycle. It was, technically speaking, an excellent report. It covered the chronology of events at Veron 7 with precision. It analyzed the strategic choices made by Sergeant Marcus Hale at each decision point. It cataloged the outcomes. 14 cadets recovered unharmed, Vrakian Raider force neutralized or dispersed, station secured for subsequent Alliance recovery operations. It used the correct clinical language throughout. It was the kind of document I was trained to produce, and it was, I believed, accurate. I read it back to myself and felt that it was missing something important. It took me some time to identify what. The report described what had happened. It did not adequately describe why it was remarkable. This was a problem because the council needed to understand not just the events but their significance, and the significance was something that lived in the gaps between the data points. It was in the 47 seconds Marcus Hale had spent crouching at Venlo's eye level. It was in the 4 words he had said on the hillside when he heard the distress signal. It was in the way the cadets had been standing outside the exit, waiting for him to come through it. These were not tactically relevant data points in any standard sense, but they were the most important things in the file. I drafted a second version of the report. The council version remained clinical and precise, as it needed to be, but I created a supplementary analysis document for my own records and for the Alliance Training Archive that attempted to capture the other things. I found it more difficult to write than anything I had produced in my career, because I kept reaching for frameworks that did not apply and having to set them aside and look at the raw data without the filters I normally used. What I kept coming back to was this: by every measurement available to me, Marcus Hale should not have been able to do what he did, not in the sense of physical impossibility, but in the sense that the calculation did not work. 31 Vrakian combatants, 2 armored vehicles, a heavy crew weapon, 1 human with a recon pack. The expected outcome was not the actual outcome, and when expected outcomes fail to materialize, there is a reason, and finding that reason is the job. The reason, as best as I could determine from all available evidence, was that Marcus Hale had not performed the calculation. Not because he was incapable of it, but because he had understood, on some level that my frameworks could not fully reach, that the calculation was not the relevant question. The relevant question was not, can this be done? The relevant question was, does this need to be done? And the moment that question resolved to yes, which it had on a hillside 3 kilometers away from a station where 14 children were locked in a supply room, everything else became secondary. I have a colleague, a senior researcher named Fetvori, who specializes in human behavioral studies. She has been doing this work for 11 years. I sent her a copy of my supplementary analysis with a message that said, simply, I need to understand what I am looking at. She replied 4 hours later with a message that said, you are looking at a human who has decided. She then added a second message. The deciding is the difficult part. Once they have decided, the rest is just events. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about the 12 Vrakian combatants who had come down that corridor toward a wounded man standing, alone, and about how that wounded man had not been calculating whether to stand there. He had already decided. He was just waiting for them to arrive. I requested the interview recordings from the post-event debrief. Marcus Hale had been interviewed 3 days after the engagement, once his medical condition allowed it. He was on a recovery cot in the station medical unit, left leg elevated, moving carefully because of the ribs. The interviewing officer was a Cathay major named Vel Sarin, who was reviewing the event for the formal record. Vel Sarin asked him, "What made you decide to respond to the distress signal without waiting for authorization?" Marcus Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There were kids in there. What was the other option?" Vel Sarin, being a thorough officer, said, "The other option was to maintain your operational position and await a coordinated response, as per protocol." Marcus Hale looked at the interviewing officer for a moment. Then he said, "With respect, Major, I do not think that was actually an option." Vel Sarin noted this in the record and moved on. "I read this exchange 4 times. I found that each time I read it, the weight of it landed differently. Not on what Marcus Hale had said, but on the complete absence of drama in how he had said it. He was not claiming heroism. He was not performing sacrifice. He was reporting a simple reality of his internal experience. The other option did not exist for him. It had not entered the set of possible responses. 14 children in danger and a man 3 kilometers away with a rifle. And in his mind there was only ever one question, which was how, not whether. I filed the interview in my personal archive and continued writing. At the end of the supplementary analysis, I wrote a section I titled Human Operational Psychology, Preliminary Observations. I want to record some of it here because it represents my honest attempt to articulate what I had learned. I wrote, "The human capacity for what they call determination appears to function differently from its nearest Cathay equivalent, which we might translate as resolve. In Cathay tactical doctrine, resolve is a resource that is managed carefully, weighted against probability assessments, and preserved through rational allocation. Resolve spent on an improbable outcome is resolve wasted. In the human operational psychology I observed at Veron 7, this framing appears fundamentally reversed. Probability assessments are subordinate to prior moral commitments. The calculus is not, is this achievable, and if so, at what cost? Calculus is this required, and if so, at any cost? I am aware this sounds irrational. I have thought about it a great deal. I no longer believe it is irrational. I believe it is a different rationality, one that begins from a different axiom, and the axiom is this. Some outcomes are non-negotiable, and when an outcome is non-negotiable, the question of probability is no longer the primary question. 14 children were going to come home. That was non-negotiable. Everything else was logistics. I submitted the council report. I kept the supplementary analysis in my private file, which I continued to add to over the following weeks as I interviewed the cadets and reviewed additional materials. One of the things I added was a transcript of my conversation with Venlo, the youngest cadet, who had been the one in the corner of the supply room. I asked him what he remembered most clearly about the rescue. He was thoughtful for a moment in the way that young Cathay are when they are trying to be precise. Then he said, he smelled like the outside, like he had been running through the grass and the soil, and he did not look at the door. When he came in and the rest of them were looking at the door, checking if it was still safe, he looked at us. I asked him what that meant to him. He said, it meant the door was not the problem anymore. The problem was us and whether we were all right, and he had decided we were going to be all right. I wrote this down. I added it to the supplementary file with the notation, decided. Fetvori was correct. I went back to Marcus Hale's service record on the final day of my analysis. I read all 11 of the notable actions entries that I had bookmarked on the first day and never gotten to. They were each remarkable in their own way. Each one was a situation that had been, by every available metric, worse than expected. Each one had ended with an outcome that the metrics had not predicted. In each one, there had been someone who needed help. In each one, there had been a man who had looked at the situation and asked a single question and gotten a single answer, and then done whatever the answer required. I closed the service record. I looked at the council report on my screen, the clean clinical document that I had spent days refining, and I looked at the supplementary analysis file, and I looked at the photograph of a man standing in front of a camera not performing anything. And then I opened a new document, not a report, not an analysis, a personal record. I wrote at the top, things I did not have a framework for. Before reviewing this file, I wrote, 1. A being that counts probability only after the moral question is already settled. 2. A being that spends 47 seconds being gentle in the middle of a situation that is demanding only speed. 3. A being that stands in a corridor with a damaged leg and a partial magazine and waits, without anxiety, for what is coming, because the waiting is the last thing required. 4. A being for whom the question of whether becomes, beyond a certain point, simply irrelevant. I looked at the list. Then I added one more. 5. A being that 16 children waited for outside an open exit in the dark because they understood, without being told, that this was what you did when someone had come back for you. I saved the document. I filed it under the classification I had created, phenomenon ongoing. I turned off my analysis station. I sat in the quiet for a moment longer than was professionally necessary, for the second time since I had opened this file. Then I thought, somewhere out there, in a recovery cot in a station medical unit, a man named Marcus was healing a leg that he had made worse on purpose, and when it was healed, he would go back to his work. And his work was the kind of work that put him 3 kilometers away from the next distress signal, and when that distress signal came, he would hear it, and he would turn toward it, and somewhere another analyst from another species would eventually open the file and review the footage, and pause the recording and sit very still for a while, the way I had, and maybe they would understand, and maybe they would not. But they would know, at the end of it, the same thing I knew, that when the universe produces a being who has collapsed the distance between intention and action until there is no gap left, the outcome of any given situation has already shifted. Not because of certainty, not because of calculation, because of what has already been decided. I have a word for that in my language. It does not translate well, but I think in human, it might simply be Marcus.